right. Surprise speaker is right. It was a surprise to me too. So, so we're all in the same boat. Well, I actually, as a master's degree student, I was a brand new Christian. Little biography here. I grew up in the Lutheran Church, which I would now call the liberal Lutheran Church. My mom's in the Missouri Synod, more conservative Lutheran Church now, but I got good training, but was never challenged to be a follower of Jesus as I understood it, or maybe it was me, not them so much. But I became a Christian in 1989, and that fall went to the University of Virginia to do a master's degree in government and foreign affairs, and had a professor, Michael Joseph Smith, who was a good Episcopal, and so I knew he was a church guy. So I said, so I'm a Christian and I'm studying politics and international relations. What should I read? How does my faith relate to what I study? And he said, you should read Niebuhr. And so I did. And I began reading Niebuhr and ended up doing my master's thesis on Reinhold Niebuhr. And it was mostly just for my own curiosity to figure out, what did I believe and what does this mean? How do I connect my faith to my work? So 30 years later, I have a book with Oxford University Press on my master's thesis. So you never know. Your undergraduate thesis or your master's thesis could actually become a book someday. So do it well. But then again, always remember what one of my professors told me: the best thesis or the best dissertation is a done dissertation. So don't do it too well. But anyway, I've written a book about Niebuhr, but it's really not his theology. So I don't think I would go to his church, actually. I would just say I look to Niebuhr not for his theology. I look for his political philosophy and how he takes a Christian worldview and projects it into politics and into foreign policy. I find that just brilliant. He had some quirks about him. I've heard some people say they weren't sure he's a Christian. I feel pretty sure he is a Christian. He believed in Jesus. He believed Jesus was the only way. He had some weird hang-ups about miracles. I never quite got that, but I think he has a small orthodox view of Scripture. And so he starts with human nature, as I do, and projects out from there. So that's what I'm going to present to you. So, and the other thing, he wrote so much stuff. It's so disparate. It's really hard to find. What did he write? Well, you could go out and read Moral Man in a Moral Society, is famous, but that was him in the early 30s, which is very different than him in the 50s. You could go read The Irony of American History, which is a brilliant book. Is the best thing I would recommend if you want to understand him on foreign policy. I would recommend that book. But what my book tries to do is to kind of sift through all that stuff and bring it together in one place, where you get to see the biography of Niebuhr, sort of the intellectual development of his thinking and his application to politics and to collective life and to foreign policy. And then what I do is I kind of apply it to some modern things like the rise of China, the Iraq War, R2P, stuff like that. And that's kind of what I do in the book. So for those of you who don't know much about him, he was a Lutheran pastor first, and he then went on and became a professor at Union Theological Seminary. I would not recommend going there. It's very liberal now. It probably was kind of liberal then, but at least a little more orthodox. But he was a professor most of his life, but he became a public intellectual, and that's the Niebuhr that most of us came to know. He was on the cover of Time magazine at least twice as the Man of the Year. I mean, he had an audience with presidents and foreign ministers and heads of state, kind of in a way, the way Billy Graham did in his later years, where people would call him and say, I need to bounce some ideas off you. He was really brilliant. And he's worthy of study as a man of faith, a Christian who then articulates politics. And so that's the interest I think I have in him. In 1948, there was even a movement for him among the Democratic Party. Actually, it was Eleanor Roosevelt who was pushing him to run for president. So he was a Democrat. Okay, now I'm not. I'm a Republican. But funny thing about him is he was attractive to left and right, because he's a man of nuance. He's not a man of categories. He's really hard to categorize. And I think it was around right after 9/11 that Michael Novak and some other Arthur Schlesinger Jr., people like them began to write sort of in popular media sources like, we really need Niebuhr now in this day and age because of the way the world has gone. Schlesinger said, a historian and a Democrat, but he said, why in an age of religiosity has Niebuhr, the supreme American theologian of the 20th century, dropped out of 21st century religious discourse? Evil was back. Niebuhr wrote about evil, and a lot of the people on the left just kind of didn't think evil was a thing. And just as recently as maybe January of this year, I mean, if you traveled around Europe and talked to IR people and foreign policy establishment types, they did not believe that Putin was going to attack Ukraine. And, we all know now that that was really naive, but that's the way a lot of thinking was. And 9/11 served that purpose back then to wake people up and say, no, there's evil in the world, and we have to deal with it. And that's something that Niebuhr really spoke to. What he's most notable for, I think, as in these circles, is his Christian realism, or human nature realism, as it's sometimes called in IR theory circles. So it's not a realism driven by structures or balance of power per se. It's not a structural theory. It's a human nature theory. Okay, and that's kind of old. It's kind of old school, but it's become new school again. So I don't know if anybody here is studying a whole lot of theory these days, but rock star constructivist Alex Wendt he wrote a book called Quantum IR, which is about kind of cognitive, like neuroscience, and he's talking about human nature. And Stephen Rosen at Harvard University is talking about human nature. And so they're not my co-religionists, but they recognize human nature matters. And as a Christian, I think human nature is where I start. And it's, are humans born good? Are they born evil? Or are they born somewhere in between? And that's where Niebuhr started. And I learned that from Niebuhr. And Niebuhr's conclusion is, I think, as Christians should conclude, that humans are evil. And fair enough, it was, before the fall, God made them good. And then the fall happened, and we've been in that cycle of evil and sin ever since. But starting with that view of human nature, Niebuhr draws a conclusion that realism is the only conclusion that makes any sense at all. So interestingly, he started out as a liberal Protestant, as a Lutheran, and a pacifist. So in the 20s and very early 30s, he saw human nature as good, and it was really, I think, the excesses of maybe World War I and I think Stalinism that began to shake his worldview a little bit, and he began to be attracted to socialism, and I guess also the excesses of Fordism, sort of industrial America. He got a pastorate in Detroit, and a lot of his flock were workers at Ford, and he thought they weren't always treated well, so he became a socialist. And then I think as Stalin's purges, kicked in more in the 30s, he began to see this also was not the answer that he was looking for. And Stalinism became worse than the disease it was meant to address. So then that is when he began to move into what we now call Christian realism, and he's probably one of the most, if not the most famous examples of that. So he rejected liberal Protestantism and its idealism. He rejected pacifism. He rejected Marxism. And then during the Cold War, he becomes the arch hawk. One of the most, if you want to call, I don't know, is hawk right wing? I mean, there are hawks on the left side as well as the right side, people who believe that the world's dangerous, so we need to use force. He became a hawk in the Cold War and an anti-communist. And so, again, human nature is where he starts. So you start at the micro and you say human nature is where we start, and then you move up then to the level of the group. And he observed that groups were more difficult to manage than individuals. So individuals might have the capacity to overcome their selfishness and their self-interested sort of behavior, in Christ. I mean, you could teach someone, if they become Christians, then the chances go way up that they can rise above that. Sometimes, as Romans 7 reminds us that, even Paul's a worm of a man. If he's a worm of a man, then I'm a grub, or I'm a amoeba, or I don't know what metaphor you want to use. But we're sinners, and Christ can help us to rise above that on occasion, and the light of Christ comes through, and praise God for every good thing we can eke out of this otherwise quite dark world. But he observed that there's a kind of moral dualism, so that you might turn your other cheek, let's say, to your fellow here, and you might decide, I'm not going to hit back. But if you're dealing with groups, or if you're a policeman, or if you're a president, a head of state, you don't have the option to turn the other cheek if you're going to risk the safety of others. If you want to sacrifice yourself on the altar of pacifism or cheek turning, that's maybe brilliant. That may be what God calls you to do. But as I read John Howard Yoder's The Politics of Jesus, and I was really challenged by that book. And it's an Anabaptist pacifist sort of treatise. And I shared that with my wife, and she looked at me and said, so, like, if you and I are walking in the park and I'm attacked by a mugger or a rapist, you're going to stand there and tell the guy that Jesus loves me and you're not going to do anything? And I just said, well, I guess that's the end of my pacifism, because that's not love. And that's the lesson that Niebuhr learned. Love means a shepherd carries a staff as well as the little hook to hold the sheep back. He also has to whack bears and lions and wolves. And so a shepherd has to have a weapon. And so that's the conclusion that Niebuhr reached. That's the conclusion I reached. So group egoism is more intense and more dangerous than individual egoism, and that's why international relations is always going to be a violent enterprise. That peace is we can hope for peace, we can work for peace, but as Niebuhr says, for peace sometimes you must risk war, is one of his famous quotes. And so that's the Christian realism he brings. The Christian view of human nature leads him to the conclusion that war is always possible, and you always have to be ready, because humans are evil. They're selfish. They're going to try to get what they can. The strong will do what they can. The weak will have to accept what they must if they're not ready. And so that's why he argued for a strong defense. And though he was liberal politically, when it came to these things, he was a conservative and a hawk. And I find it helpful as we think about the world today. The concept of responsibility to protect, ironically, is not always appreciated as much on the right as on the left, but I think it should be. And I think Niebuhr, R2P, as it's called now, was not around when he was alive. But in the 30s, he was arguing famously against his brother H. Richard Niebuhr. Don't get them confused. Christ and Culture is H. Richard. All the other stuff is Reinhold. Reinhold wrote a lot more. But in Christian seminaries, probably his brother H. Richard is more famous because of Christ and Culture, which is a great book. But Niebuhr and Richard had an argument about the war, the Japanese invasion of China. And H. Richard wrote a book called The Grace of Doing Nothing, pacifist argument. And Niebuhr wrote back, we can't do nothing. We have to stand up, because if we let this happen, what's next? Kind of a domino idea. If we let this go, what's next? It's morally wrong to stand by and do nothing. The Good Samaritan story comes to mind. All these people walked by, and then somebody helped the guy, and Jesus praised that person. He was an early supporter of the civil rights movement. A white middle-class guy from the Midwest had really reached out to the black community in Detroit and other places, and he cared about racism. Really bothered him. And actually, Martin Luther King Jr. was very inspired by Niebuhr. They were both pastors, after all, and they both realized racism was an evil, horrendous sin. And so he was an early civil rights guy. Niebuhr very early, perhaps because his wife was British, and the British saw Hitler a little earlier as a danger than Americans did. In the mid-30s, he was already arguing the United States has to get more engaged. Hitler's dangerous. He's very dangerous. And he was arguing for U.S. intervention in the war early. He was a Zionist. He was arguing, again, before the Holocaust, do the Jews need a homeland? He was very close to a lot of the Jewish intellectual leaders on the East Coast during his day, and was played a very important role, actually, after World War II in pushing the World Council of Churches, the British government, and others to recognize the need for a Jewish homeland. So those are all the kind of things he stood for. Moving on to the question of just war, I argue in my book that he is a just war guy. Okay, now I know somebody who was actually a teacher to me in a program I was a part of. It was this Pew thing that I did as a PhD student. Keith Pavlicek, some of you may know Keith. Keith argues that Niebuhr was not a just war person, that he was an anything goes kind of guy, And I don't think that is right, and I talk about that in the book. But I would argue that Niebuhr was very much in the just war tradition. I mean, he clearly wasn't a pacifist, so what's left if you're a Christian? Just war. But there can be different ways to articulate just war, and I think Niebuhr was pretty consistent. He didn't write as much about the in bello part, which is part of the reason I think Pavlicek rightly in some ways criticizes him for not being clear about it. He sort of waffled on the use of nuclear weapons against Japan. He called it, in one place he says, we've lowered ourselves to the level of Nazi morality. Like the Nazi bombing of London and the bombing of Japan in 46, I think he said that. But later during the Cold War, he changed his view and came to see that nuclear war could be within the just war tradition. And that's a debate that went on. But I applied him in the book to the Iraq War, and my conclusion on that one was that the war on terror could be argued as being just, and that I think he would have argued it as such, but that the war on Iraq was not in the just war tradition. And I paired him up against Gene Elshtain, who wrote a book called Just War on Terror. And I think the book has tons of holes in it, and I think he would have pointed out all those holes. And so I argue that he would not have called the 2003 invasion of Iraq a war in the just war tradition. After all, we were not attacked by Iraq. Iraq, we know now they did not have weapons of mass destruction, although there is evidence that the North Koreans actually had talked to Saddam about an exchange, but they actually stymied him, just sort of ripped him off, actually. And they were not preparing to attack us, and they were not involved in the 9/11 attacks. And so for all those reasons, there's other things we could argue there, but I don't think that was really a good candidate for a just war from an American perspective. I also argue about China is what I study. That's most of my writing is about Chinese foreign policy, Chinese politics. So I asked the question, I have a chapter, what would Niebuhr say if he was around right now about the rise of China? And he wrote a lot about the Soviet Union. And obviously China and the Soviet Union are pretty different, but there's some patterns. They're both communist dictatorships. Somebody might argue China's not really communist. Yeah, it's not. Neither was the Soviet Union. I mean, if we're talking about orthodox Marxism, neither one of them was. But they both hold to that sort of ideology. And so it's a fairly long chapter, and I argue that he would have been a hawk on China, and that its regime type, being undemocratic is a threat. The sort of master narrative of the Chinese Communist Party today stands in direct contradiction to Western theories of openness and liberalism and human rights and all that kind of stuff. The brainwashing that goes on today is more advanced, more brilliant, or heinous than anything we've seen so far. I mean, you think North Korea is bad, they're closed. I mean, it's a closed society. China's so open, and yet the people are all like the people in the Matrix is the best analogy I can think of. You're plugged into this thing, and you don't even know that you're being fed an alternate world that anybody else who does not live there knows is not true. And some of my wife's Chinese and some of the loved ones, relatives that I care about are deceived by this, and it's very dangerous. And so a government like that can say jump, and the people say how high. And that's a dangerous thing from anyone's perspective if you're on the other side of that. And then lastly, the role of human nature. I mean, the Communist Party is run by humans, and Xi Jinping now is unaccountable to anybody except maybe the United States. He's unaccountable to the other members of the standing committee. There's 7 guys there. There used to be a couple, 2 or 3, that would once in a while say, with all due respect, maybe we should think about this. Those guys are out, and now a couple of new guys are in who are very young and are completely beholden politically to Xi Jinping. And so, it's a dangerous situation. He doesn't have anyone to tell him he's wrong ever now. And so that does not end well normally in politics and international relations. So the other thing is just the material reality of China's rise. It's becoming powerful. The economy is growing, and they have capabilities that they did not have before, which means they can do things, and the United States has to be prepared. I also talk about just the whole rise of post-truth. And Niebuhr wrote a lot about leaders like Kennedy, and others. He did not like Kennedy. He actually voted Republican, I think, in that election because he didn't like what Kennedy stood for. He thought Kennedy is a cheater. He's cheating on his wife. He's having affairs. He thinks he's God's gift to the nation, and he could not support Kennedy. I conclude that he would not have liked Donald Trump. I'm sorry, but I don't think he would like Donald Trump. And he would predict that, the book came out before Putin invaded Ukraine, but that's exactly what he would have expected because the West did not really stand up to Putin sufficiently. And there was so much division in the Western European capitals, they weren't really afraid of Putin. They thought, oh, no, he's not that stupid. He wouldn't do that. Well, he did. And he wasn't stupid. He's smart. He knew he played his hand very well. And so I think Niebuhr would have foreseen that. And I think he would have been very skeptical about Donald Trump and Donald Trump's attacks on truth. And both sides' attacks on truth these days, right? I mean, we live in a world where truth now is, you can have your alternate facts, and one side's got alternate facts, and the other side has the mainstream media in their back pocket and can sort of push agendas. And it's a weird place to live. So I read the New York Times and the Washington Times every day and try to figure out what's really going on. I mean, that's all you can do now. So the post-truth world that we live in wouldn't be a surprise to Niebuhr either, I guess. I mean, he lived in the 30s, which unfortunately today's looking more and more like the 30s than ever. The great ideologies are back. You have the granddaughter of Mussolini now running Italy. You have Mr. Putin over there in Russia with a kind of ideology, kind of a Euro-nationalist, Russian nationalist ideology that is pretty racist, frankly, and it's a weird world. And Niebuhr, it's good to go back and read Niebuhr, I think, in times like this. I think he's a good tonic for this. So I think I'll wind down here. I have a whole chapter if you're interested in theory. I would argue that he had a heavy dose of existentialism undermining his theory, which is why he was kind of really interesting, a lot more interesting than, let's say, Morgenthau or Mearsheimer or those newer realists. Myself, I find it helpful to be Christian realist as a prescription to foreign policy. Like when you're trying to decide what to do, Niebuhr is just brilliant. It makes a lot of sense to guide. As I think about things, I think about it from a Niebuhrian perspective. But myself, I'm really a constructivist. As I step back and just do analysis of the whole social milieu of the world that we live in and trying to understand what is true, to me, constructivism makes more sense with the human nature thing in there underneath that. And so I'm going to end with just a couple of quotes of Niebuhr for those who aren't familiar with him. He has a famous quote. He says, "Man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but man's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary." I think that's really true. And the last one, and the one that maybe everybody in this room has heard, but you probably did not know it was Niebuhr, is a prayer. God, give us grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, courage to change the things that should be changed, and wisdom to distinguish the one from the other. And I think that's something that's really good to leave with. So we have time for questions, I think, if Mark says it's okay. And Mark is not here, so we can do whatever we want. So oh, he is there. Oh, he is listening. Okay. Usually he kind of appears over here. Yes.
Nathan Moyes, LaTourneau University. So having read War, Man, and Immoral Society, I remember specifically that Niebuhr brings up this idea of a separated personal morality and a public morality, and that because, as you mentioned, it's difficult to be moral in large groups of people where there's all these competing ideologies, we have to somewhat separate ourselves from what we consider moral in that group and national setting. So what sort of precedent do you think that sets, especially for us in the Christian national security community, where we're trying to, as Christians, bring our faith to bear on broader politics? Should we follow Niebuhr's idea of leaving that at the door a bit more, or should we try to engage that and risk the pitfall of idealism?
Okay. Well, first of all, that's a great question. You don't have to leave your morality at the door. Okay, Niebuhr, and that would be a misreading of Niebuhr, and he would be the first one to say, I never said that. What he does say, there's a quote, he says, you can't deal with Aunt Mary the same way you deal with Hitler. okay, if your Aunt Mary is doing something really annoying, you can talk to her, you can, but with Hitler, you can tell him, you can negotiate with him. And Neville Chamberlain did. The Russians did. Look at the Molotov-Ribbentrop Act. They made a deal, and Hitler violated it. So the point Niebuhr would make is it's not going to work with Hitler. That doesn't mean you never negotiate, but it's just you have to be realistic about what you're dealing with. That would be one thing. But the moral dualism does make us uncomfortable because for us as Christians, there's one truth with a capital T, and we do not compromise. I wouldn't, and I don't encourage you to compromise. But that's where the realism comes in. And there's a Hegelian dualism going on in Niebuhr's work. And on the cover of the book, I have this you see a little orange and the blue fire, kind of like the Emperor in Star Wars when he goes, and that blue fire comes out. And then there's the different color lightsabers. So Niebuhr saw the world that way. There's these opposing forces, but they're not equal. The light is the light, and the light's going to prevail. But you're dealing with he liked this kind of dualism and this kind of dialectic, and this moral dualism would be one of those kind of things. He would say, we are who we are. We live for Christ. To live to Christ, to die is to gain. And yet, if you're the defense secretary or the president, and you're going to have to make some decisions, let's say. In World War II, the 633 Squadron, this thing where the Germans were building heavy water plants in Norway, and the British Air Force, the RAF, decided we got to take it out. And they found out the Germans had built an Allied prisoner of war camp all around the facility, so that if you bomb it, you're going to kill your own people. So what do you do? And this is the kind of thing, this dualism. Well, we know what is right, but we also have to look to what is the greater good. And it's not an ends justify the means thing, but it's a realism about sometimes you have to make difficult decisions. And so that's, I think, how he would answer that question. I hope that helps a little bit.
Thank you. My name is John Tierney, Institute of World Politics again. That last statement you made about Reinhold Niebuhr,
Mm-hmm.
do you know that statement, I've been in AA for about 12 years.
Uh-huh.
That is the statement.
Oh, the prayer?
Daily prayer
Yep.
from Alcoholics Anonymous.
That's right.
That statement is repeated every single day and night
That's
by
right.
millions of people.
That's right.
I've never known the source of it. Thank you so much.
Isn't that crazy? Nobody knows where that came from. But yes, he wrote it in about 1955, and Alcoholics Anonymous adopted it, and that's the prayer they pray. And one of my best friends got saved in Alcoholics Anonymous. It's not an evangelical organization, but God's kind of there, and so yeah, it's a beautiful thing. Thanks for
Unbelievable.
yeah, that's Reinhold Niebuhr. Yeah. Any other questions? Niebuhr is so kind of all over the map. I'm surprised there's not more questions. All right. Well, thank you for your time, and God bless you.